The largest single-block statue on Earth has a human face and a lion's body, and after 200 years of study, nobody can say for certain whose face it is. The Great Sphinx carries no inscription from its own builders, no label naming the king it was meant to honor. And in the last few decades, a second argument has opened underneath the first one, weathering on its enclosure walls that some geologists read as the signature of heavy rain, on a monument the history books say was carved in a desert. If arguments historians still haven't settled are your kind of thing, subscribe and stay for a monument that has kept its own secret for thousands of years. Giza sits on a broad limestone plateau just west of modern Cairo, and by the middle centuries of the Old Kingdom, it held 3 enormous pyramids and 1 guardian carved not from imported stone, but from the ground itself. Workers cut down into a natural outcrop of bedrock, leaving the rough shape of a crouching lion with a human head, then built up the paws and chest with quarried blocks stacked around that core. At roughly 73 meters long and 20 meters tall, it remains the largest single monolithic statue anywhere on the planet, its head alone standing taller than a 6-story building. The face we see today is bare limestone, but it was not always. Excavators have found traces of red pigment surviving in patches on the face, and remnants of blue and yellow paint elsewhere on the body, evidence that the whole statue was once brightly colored rather than the pale, weathered stone tourists photograph now. Almost none of that paint survived the centuries between. No contemporary inscription says who ordered the statue carved or whose face it was meant to wear. That silence is unusual for a civilization that labeled almost everything else it built, from tomb walls to furniture, and it is the gap every argument about the Sphinx has had to fill ever since. The face has taken damage too, and not only from weather. Its nose is missing, and the popular story blaming Napoleon's soldiers for target practice does not hold up. Sketches of a noseless Sphinx exist from well before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt. A medieval Arab historian recorded a different account. A religious zealot chiseled away the nose and ears in the 1370s, offended that villagers were leaving offerings to the statue in hopes of a good harvest. The crowd that caught him afterward did not let him walk away from it. The leading candidate is Khafre, the king who built the second pyramid at Giza. A stone causeway once ran nearly half a kilometer from that pyramid down to a valley temple that still stands beside the Sphinx's paws. When that temple was cleared out in the 19th century, excavators found the remains of more than 20 statues of Khafre buried inside it, most of them smashed. Only one had survived nearly whole, a seated figure carved from a single block of hard black stone, a falcon god wrapped protectively around the back of the king's head. That statue is now one of the most reproduced images of Old Kingdom kingship anywhere, and it gives scholars the closest thing they have to a control photograph for Khafre's actual face, broad and heavy-lidded, the same features carved into the Sphinx. That resemblance, more than anything written down, is why his name is the one most textbooks print. Centuries later, a new kingdom king named Thutmose IV fell asleep in the statue's shadow and dreamed that the Sphinx spoke to him, promising him the throne if he dug the sand away from its buried body. He had the dream carved onto a stone tablet known as the Dream Stela and set it between the statue's paws, where visitors still read it today. The stela calls the statue sacred. It does not call it Khafre. That absence has kept the identification an argument rather than a fact. 19th and 20th century Egyptologists floated other names from the same family. Khufu himself, whose towering Great Pyramid stands closest of all three to the Sphinx's own gaze. Or, some argued, Khufu's short-reigned son Djedefre, who ruled briefly between Khufu and Khafre and has largely vanished from popular memory. None of the competing cases carry direct proof either. What the Khafre attribution has is context: a causeway, a temple, a family resemblance carved in stone, not a signature. Around the Great Sphinx of Giza, the limestone walls of its enclosure carry a strange kind of weathering. Everywhere else at Giza, exposed stone shows the horizontal scouring that wind and blowing sand leave behind over centuries. But sections of the walls cut around the Sphinx show something different: deep, rounded vertical grooves, the kind more commonly produced by long exposure to flowing or standing water. To a handful of geologists, that reading points somewhere uncomfortable. Egypt has not seen sustained heavy rainfall since long before the pyramids were built. If the weathering really was carved by rain, the Sphinx's body would have to predate the pyramids standing beside it by thousands of years, cut by a civilization history has no name for. That is not a small disagreement. Egypt's last long stretch of regular monsoon rain, the period geologists call the Green Sahara, faded out roughly 2,000 years before Khafre ever took the throne. Push the Sphinx's carving back far enough to explain rain damage on that scale, and the statue no longer belongs to the civilization that built the pyramids standing beside it. It belongs to an Egypt nobody has found any other trace of. No settlements from it, no tools, no burials, nothing except one weathered rock. The argument got its biggest public airing at a geology conference in the early 1990s, where the room split close to evenly between geologists convinced by the water reading and geologists who were not. 3 decades later, that split has barely narrowed. Most Egyptologists reject the older timeline, and not by waving the weathering away. Excavations around the Sphinx's own temple have turned up limestone blocks quarried from the same enclosure, worked with Old Kingdom tools beside a planned settlement of bakeries, breweries, and worker housing dated by pottery and seal impressions to the reigns of Khafre and his successor Menkaure. The scale of that operation argues against the old picture of slave gangs dragging stone under the whip. Feeding a workforce large enough to raise these monuments on schedule took bread by the ton and organization, not just force. Geologists on this side of the argument also note that Old Kingdom Egypt, while already dry, was not yet the hyper-arid desert of today, and that occasional heavy storms are attested in the geological record for exactly this period, which would produce similar vertical weathering without requiring a lost civilization at all. If the water erosion reading were correct anyway, the consequences would reach far past one statue. Egypt's earliest firmly dated writing, organized agriculture, and monumental architecture all cluster within a few centuries of the Old Kingdom itself. A sphinx carved thousands of years earlier would belong to a culture with none of that yet in place, one somehow capable of shaping the largest monolithic statue on the planet and then leaving no other trace of itself anywhere in the archaeological record. Neither side has found the one piece of evidence that would end either argument outright. A foundation deposit, a builder's inscription, anything from the Sphinx's own century naming its patron or its age. So the identity question and the age question both remain exactly where they have sat for 2 centuries, debated in books and at conferences, never settled by a single line the original builders bothered to leave behind. Every generation gets to take its own turn arguing with the rock, with whatever new instrument or old text it has on hand, and so far the rock has outlasted the argument. Which mystery would you want answered first? Whose face that is? Or how old the stone underneath it really is? Tell me in the comments. Khafre's own father raised the largest pyramid ever built, and yet only one confirmed image of that king's face survives anywhere on Earth, a statuette barely 3 inches tall. That story is next.